rental ads. When you're writing these, oh, that's okay. When you're writing these rental ads, you have to be very, very careful not to discriminate because you could be sued, right? You could be sued. You cannot close the door to individuals that are protected under the Human Rights Code. So just be very, very careful in how you word it. My advice to people is be very general in nature, right? If you want to screen people, screen them through the screening process, through the application process. That's where you can weed out people, but you cannot weed them out by putting discriminatory comments or just not even knowing that they're discriminatory in a rental ad to weed people out. You can't do that. So huge issue. I've seen many people get sued on this, and it's for hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not talking about thousands of $1,000. I had a case the other day, the lady came to me and she said, I'm being sued for $100,000 because I specifically asked for, I left out a specific race. I said, I do not want this kind of person. And by doing that, she discriminated.
Oh boy.
She put it in writing.
Wow, she put it in writing. So it's advertised in a public place. It's
Right.
attached to her identity. She can't get out of that one.
Can't get out of it.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
So this is kind of funny, but I've had people who were, when we used to run, Gil and I ran a property management business. We're also individual investors. And we used to have people who were Chinese who said, we don't want any Chinese tenants. And I said, well, what do you mean you're Chinese? They said, we don't want Chinese people. I've had East Indian people tell me the same thing. I don't want East Indian tenants. I said, well, we can't discriminate. When we had the business, we said, that's not something that you can do. You can't write it in. I can't tell them that. But there are people who try to get around it though. Like they might tell their property manager, I don't want this ethnicity in my property. And you know, you can take the application form, but weed everybody out. So how are those people held accountable, or are they held accountable?
So let me just say this, just because you say you don't want someone from your own background does not mean it's not discrimination. There's something called shadeism. It's not well known, but discrimination is discrimination. It doesn't matter what way you shape it. Doesn't matter if it's your own circle, it's discrimination. So how are they held accountable? Well, it's hard to prove, okay? You really have to get it in writing. I've had situations where a realtor or a property manager has said, you know, like most recently in a mixed family, that we don't want a family like yours, we want a normal family, right? So things like that, it's not in writing, but people witness that, and they can be held accountable to it through the court process, through a tribunals process, but it's not easy to prove. I'll be honest with you, it's not straightforward. That's why I say, again, be very general in nature as to how you put your ads out there, and through the screening process as well, the application and screening process. If you don't want a tenant, just tell them, look, we found someone else, or, you know, unfortunately, we're not accepting you. You don't have to give a reason why.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, actually, we've mentioned that many times to people. It's in some of my articles as well. It's like, don't give so many specifics that you've given them a reason to sue you. Just be very general. Just say, thank you very much for your application. Unfortunately, we will not be proceeding. All the best to you.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
one of the interesting things that you run into, you mentioned you can't ask them if they have an income, but you can ask them to prove that they can afford the property.
You can, but you should be doing it along with other checks, credit check, proof of income. Never do it by itself, right?
Oh,
If
okay.
you start to combine checks, then you are allowed to decline someone based on multiple factors. It's when you say, like for example, a person on social assistance, okay? If you decline them, and that because that's their only income, they'll know. So you have to ask them, give me your credit check, give me background checks, give me employment letters if you have them. Who's your worker? Can we get a letter from your worker as to how much you actually receive? That's the best way to do it, right? You
So
don't, yeah, go ahead.
I have read that you shouldn't be using a percentage of your income as a guide to whether or not a person can afford to rent a property.
Right, that's rent to income ratios. Yeah, that's correct.
So
You can't-
that's discouraged.
Mhm.
But let's face it, everyone does it. Because if you look at an application form and let's say the rent is $2,500 and the person who's applying makes $2,450 and it doesn't cover all of their expenses, you'd be looking at this and saying, well, you're over 100% of your income. How can you afford this?
So you have to find another factor to look at as well,
Okay.
right? You
So
should
what does that
not,
look like?
so look at other things. Look at not just employment, look at the background checks. Go to the background of their previous landlords. You know, the size of the property. Can this size of the property accommodate this many people? Find other things to ask, right? So I always say to people, get yourself a good application form that asks for multiple things, right? So I like to refer to the Landlord Self-Help Center. They have some, depending on where you're watching this video, there may be a local group or a group that has some, but do not decline somebody based on one factor, because that can be discriminatory in nature. And I just want to be very clear. This is not me saying this. This is the law. So
Yes.
I know people get really angry at me. Oh, Samantha, why are you saying that? This is actually in the legislation. So it's set out very, very clearly that you cannot do that.
Okay. I also
Now-
have an application on my 10 essential editable landlord forms on my website. Just had to put a shameless plug in there.
Absolutely.
And it
Absolutely.
does ask for multiple screening devices. So yes.
So one more question, if I could. Human
Yes.
rights, is that a provincial or is that a federal law? I think it's provincial.
So it would be provincial in each province. There is a commission which deals federally in the Canadian human rights, but for landlord and tenant, it is a provincial piece of legislation.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So if you're in Ontario, definitely
If you're
listen to Samantha. And if
Yes.
you are in Alberta, read the forums. They're online, they're free. And they're pretty, I think they're pretty easy to understand.
I just want to add something to what you just said. I mean, the answers are on the forms, from all forms that I've seen. Most people don't read the form. That's where mistakes happen, right? It's very, very clear, even in some guides the governments produce. It's very, very clear what you should and should not do. People just don't read it. That's
Yeah.
the biggest problem.
Yes. Back to my original, the reason I decided to have have you on this show is because a lot of landlords go into this just thinking they're going to wing it. And when they have an issue, then they'll deal with it. And as you could see from her, I don't know if she was your client, but the lady who got sued $100,000 because she had a
Yes.
discriminatory ad, that is not the time to wing it. Really, after you have a property, you need to learn the laws, because if you don't learn them, they'll victimize you later on.
Absolutely.
Now I'm going to move on to what happens when you get, I call them unregistered guests. That's what the RTA calls them. But I like your term better, squatters. So you have
Yes.
somebody who has not put their name on the application form. You've never met them before. The tenant has just allowed them to move in. They're living in your property. What do you do with them? What can you do?
Okay, so let me just step back for a second. I see people all over social media say, oh, the person's not paying rent, so they're a squatter. That's not a squatter, okay? A squatter is kind of what you defined. I always get cases where the squatter is somebody that somehow gained access. We don't know how, and now they've all of a sudden taken the property hostage. That's what I say. And I hate to be blunt about it. I don't know what happens, but I always get them. So what happens when you have a squatter is you need to act immediately. Depending on your local laws, you need to check the limitation periods. Our limitation period is very, very set in stone. It's when you find out, you must file an application with your local court or tribunal right away to indicate that this person is not your tenant. Okay. Now, a tenant can usually move in whoever the heck they want. They can move in roommates, they can move in friends, and then they could just leave and then the person takes over. Again, you have to look at your local court or tribunal and see if they have a way to, like in Ontario, we have the unauthorized occupant. So you have to apply immediately to get them out. Or another way is reach out to the old tenant and say, hey, who's this person here? Why are they here? If you're not going to be here, why don't you sign off legally that you're leaving? And then you could potentially evict them that way. But you really have to be careful with dealing with squatters. I'm not sure about Alberta. I can talk to you about Ontario. The police will not get involved here.
Mhm.
They'll say it's out of our jurisdiction. It's not trespassing.
Yes.
Too bad. Go to the board.
Yeah.
So you have to be very careful. And when you have somebody like this, you need to get help right away because they could be taking over your unit for a very long time. And it's hard to get rid of them.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yes. Yeah. And not getting paid any money. No rent, nothing. So
I remember talking to a guy when we had the property management business. Gil did a showing for this fellow, and he told us that we asked him about the last place that he lived, and he said he left on not great terms, not great conditions. And what had happened was he took some guy in because some guy sang him some good cry story about, you know, how hard up he was. And he said, okay, well, I've got another room in my house. You can come stay with me. It's a rental. Anyway, that guy moved in. He invited other friends to move in, and it turned into Party Central. And these other people were just totally overrunning the place. The original tenant didn't know what to do. He was overwhelmed, and he just left. He just packed up his stuff. He left in the middle of the night. Anyway, he's telling Gil this, like, and he wants an application for the property. Gil showing him, and Gil finds an excuse to move him on his way. But I'm thinking, wow, talk about not connecting the dots. He did a midnight move with his last place, and not only did he not pay his rent, he stuck them with a whole house full of squatters, but now they have to try and evict somehow. I mean, what a mess. Every landlord's nightmare.
Yeah, it is. I'm just going to tell you a very quick story as well. I had a client who had a friend at work that they were being evicted, and she felt bad for them. And she said, look, you can temporarily stay in my basement. It's not a finished basement. It's all concrete, you know, like an unfinished. I have a laundry room down there. There's a bathroom. You could stay there for a week or two. These people took over her basement.
Oh no.
They would not leave, and they were bathing in the laundry sink. They were trying to cook with a toaster, like it's dangerous. And, you know, every time that they tried to leave, my client was locking the door on them, and the police would come and say, look, you can't lock them out. It's an illegal lockout. But it wasn't an illegal lockout because they were not a tenant, but they were paying her money, which turned into a tenancy.
Yes, yeah.
Right. And then they wanted to bring her to the board and say, look, landlord didn't maintain the unit. There was no unit. It's not even a unit. So it took some time to work with the police to get these individuals removed. I was actually shocked that the police would involve themselves, but you have to be careful. Like, even when you're trying to be nice to somebody, it can go sideways. And like, she wasn't sharing a kitchen or bathroom. And in Ontario, if you share a kitchen and bathroom, the act doesn't apply. She wasn't sharing anything with them. They became tenants. So it's terrible. I felt very bad for her. She was stuck with them for a few months. And I hate to talk so negatively. Like, I hate to say this, but
you know, these situations happen. And like, a lot of people think, well, I work with this person, as your colleague did.
yes,
How bad could they be? It must have been a really bad landlord. I'll help them out. This is not the first time I've heard this story, by the way. I mean, different players, but you know, somebody want to help somebody out. Obviously, the person is a bad tenant, which is why they're being evicted.
yeah,
Or the landlord says, okay, yeah, it's okay. You can stay there for a week or two. Doesn't have them fill out any application form, doesn't screen them at all, has no idea who they're dealing with, and they've got a professional tenant on their hands and a huge
Absolutely.
problem. So, I mean, that's kind of heartbreaking because, yeah, I've had people call me in tears because they're in that situation, that it's tough.
You just got to be hard ass. My first tenants, they were friends of friends, and I thought, well, so I didn't do any kind of checks at all, and they turned into the kind of tenants that you don't want, not paying rent and stuff like that. They did a midnight move rather than pay rent. I lost a couple months of income, but I learned my lesson.
yeah. You have to be careful when it comes to situations. Oh, do me a favor, or hey, do a favor for my friend. I say no. I tell my parents that too, and I tell the rest of my family, look, this is a business.
It's a business.
Yeah, like I understand, you know, things. People used to work on a handshake. I don't know if if I say I'm going to do something and I shake your hand, then that's it. But now people are so educated, or they believe that they're educated. When they go on social media, they ask each other questions. They think it's the right answer. And so they're there to fight each other. And there is no handshake. Everything has to be done by a contract. So
yeah. Document.
Yeah.
And this is whatever you want them to do, to follow whatever your rules and regulations are. Make sure you've got a copy, they've got a copy, make sure you've covered your bases. Yes, we'll talk about documentation a little bit later. So maybe Gil, you want to deal with this question?
Which question is that? How to evict following the law? Okay.
mm-mm.
Evicting following the law. So this is going to be specific to Ontario again.
Because Alberta has different eviction rules than Ontario has.
Absolutely. So I will say this, you can't just lock the door.
No.
Okay. There are people that call me, they're like, Samantha, I'm going to bring my friend who's like 7 foot tall and he's like 300 pounds, and we're just going to go lock the door and remove this person. Can't do that. The fines are huge. Okay.
What kind of fines are we talking about?
hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Really?
It's a fine from the ministry, as well as you can be taken to the landlord and tenant board, and they can also ding you with money. So we're talking a lot of money here. It's not $1,000 or $2,000. Now for corporations, it's even bigger. So you have to be careful. And that's why I say to landlords, you know, take a course, learn how to be a landlord. We have a landlord self-help center, right? They have a membership. It's a small amount. You can call them and say, hey, how do I do something? And they'll tell you how to do it. They have guides and videos, you know, find information. But what I see is people go on forums, they go online, they search it. It's like a do-it-yourself. This is not a do-it-yourself area, right? You have to learn the information, learn the foundation, learn preventative measures, and then, you know, you could do it yourself once somebody's taught you how to do it. So evicting correctly is knowing which forms to use and understanding that if you make an error on any of these notices, the notice gets kicked out.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll tell you, just going to the hearing and going to a couple of hearings recently with, I have students, I was teaching them the Residential Tenancies Act. We went there, and of 100 hearings that were on that docket that day, about 75 got dismissed for error.
Oh my gosh.
It's insane. And people have been waiting for months to get hearing dates because of the backlog, right? So simple things like a postal code, or the name spelled incorrectly, or the unit is not included, or the unit number is wrong. Okay, so that's like that. You can't mess up on any of that, right? So know that it has to be perfect, right? Then know what notice to use in what situation. Learn how to fill out the notice by reading the forms, reading the notices and the guides. It is the key. If you can do it yourself, if you analyze it, and if you don't understand, make a phone call and get the answers. But don't take matters into your own hands, you know, and try to show up at the board and, you know, it's wrong, and then start to fight with an adjudicator, because the adjudicator will just kick it out, right? So you have to be very, very careful, know the forms, know what your rights and responsibilities are under the Residential Tenancies Act here in Ontario, and understand that there's resources. Somebody tells you information on social media, always get legal advice.
Yes.
Right? Don't just rely on someone. Like my experience might be different from your experience, right? So you can't put every single case, every single situation into the same box. It's not. And one little nuance, one little piece of information can change the whole case.
Yeah.
So get legal advice. There are professionals that do free consultations and will walk you through what to do. That's my advice on that.
Yeah, so not just, I would say if you're going to call a lawyer, firstly, I wouldn't start with a lawyer. I would start with the landlord tenant boards, because like Service Alberta, there are a number of nonprofit landlord tenant organizations that are excellent in Alberta. I would start with that. I would start with the RTA. And then if you start feeling really overwhelmed with the whole process and you think, I don't have the time for this, I'm afraid of making mistakes, what should you do?
Well, look, here we have paralegals, right? Paralegals are in the board all the time. Like I said, we have the Landlord Self-Help Center. I have clients that have done it wrong, and they were out over the monetary limitation for the landlord and tenant board, which is 35,000. I have people that are at 60,000 and up.
Oh no.
And they have to go to a court. They have no choice but to hire a lawyer. So if they would have done it correct to begin with, they would have saved more money. They would have saved time and money. Look, you don't have to necessarily show up at the board. These professionals can go there for you. And yes, it costs some money, but it's probably less to do it right than to do it wrong.
Yeah,
so that's why I always say, just spend the money. It's worth it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. We've known some, we know 2 eviction services who will basically do the whole thing for you. You
From
never
beginning
have to,
to end.
never have to lift a finger, and they know what they're doing. That's key. Like you might have to spend, what was it, 800 or
Well,
1,000 or
I think
something?
when I called around at one point, I think it was anywhere between 650 and 800 and something, depending on how complicated your situation was.
Exactly. It depends on how much work goes into it. Like a non-payment of rent is much simpler than a tenant harassing another tenant, or drugs, or whatever else it is. They're causing a disturbance of reasonable enjoyment. There's more work that goes into them. So yes, absolutely, price will vary. But also, you mentioned something, knowing people that can do these things right? I always say to people, you don't have to come to me, shop around. Like we all do the same thing. Who do you feel comfortable with? Who do you feel when you have a conversation that you feel confident in their skills and their abilities, right? There might be people that are out, licensed paralegals that have been out a few years that you feel more comfortable with than me, who's going on 11 years of practice. It really is a relationship, because you're going to be with this person. It could be 6 months, a year, who knows? So you have to have that comfort with them, that you can have a conversation with them and they're going to tell you straight, this is what's going to happen, right? So
make sure that they're qualified in what you do. Like I would say, don't go to a general lawyer, go to a real estate lawyer.
Yes.
Because not all lawyers are created equally. And a lawyer who does family practice is not going to be as well versed with the Residential Tenancies Act and landlord tenant laws as a real estate lawyer is.
I agree with you.
You need to get, anytime I've gone for legal advice, I go to a real estate lawyer. I've got a couple go-to people. That's who I go to. Because I'll get a very different answer from them than if I just ask someone who's in a general law practice.
You got to understand, they're not in these venues. They can read the law. Anyone can read the law. It's what do the players within that tribunal or in that venue, how do they make decisions? Does this individual know the judges? So what we do in our practice, and I believe others do this too, is we actually go and sit in hearings. If we don't have a hearing that day, or even if we've had a hearing and we're done, we're going to sit in and listen to the way that these adjudicators make decisions, so that we know if we appear before a specific adjudicator, we know exactly what they're looking for, how they want it presented. So it's very important. Like, I agree with you 100%. I wouldn't go to a doctor to repair the brakes on my car. So you need to find the right professional for what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
The other point that I always like to make about getting outside help for this sort of thing is if you try to do it yourself, you don't have the experience, you may not find the fastest route to accomplishing your goal, which means you're going to continue to lose income. So the actual cost of an eviction service compared to the lost revenue it's inconsequential. If you don't know what you're doing, spending the money will save you money.
Absolutely. I agree.
So then once you have got a court hearing, how do you prepare and proceed with a hearing?
So it's very important that you have all documents that are necessary. So what I always say to people is, if you're going to do it on your own, read the rules. So our tribunal, yes, there's a Residential Tenancies Act, but there are also things like the board's rules and practice directions that the Landlord and Tenant Board by legislation is allowed to create for themselves. So they are very clear what they're looking for. If we're talking about a non-payment of rent application, you're going to show that you did everything you could to try to enter into a repayment agreement with the tenant, right? And it's actually stipulated by the act that you must try. So you have to show, I emailed them, I sent them a letter, I have phone calls, here's my call records. They have not paid rent. Usually they pay by e-transfer, here's all my records, and I have no records from these months. So you have to, I call it CYA. I'm not going to tell you what that means. I'll just say this, cover your. You really need to do that. Same with things like harassment or violations of overcrowding or damages to the property. So I always say to landlords, before you rent out the unit, you're going to take photos of the unit ahead of time, right? You're going to make sure you document everything. You said it, I think you said it earlier, documentation beats conversation. Document, document, document. You said that. And that is the absolute truth. So you need to show, this is how my unit looked before. When I went to do the inspection on this date at this time, because the photos are going to be time and date stamped, this is how it looks now, right? You need to come prepared. Otherwise, an adjudicator doesn't understand. They don't know you. They're just listening to the facts of what you put before them.
Right.
So you need to show them the impact that these damages have had. How much do they cost, right? You need to walk them through, take them down the yellow brick road and show them every aspect of that application. So with our applications for damages, you have to be very clear that on this day at this time, the application is very specific, that it asks for date and time and what happened. You need to explain it. Now, what people run into is that our notices, and I don't know if you have this problem where you are, but our notices are they have 3 small boxes on them. You can barely fit anything. So people try to write in like 4-point font onto the notice. thinking that people can read it. You don't have to do that. Attach an additional document and explain everything in detail. This is what happened. This is when it happened. This is what I tried to do about it. And this is the impact it's had on me as the landlord, right? So you need to come prepared, because an adjudicator, if you're sitting there and you're trying to go over documents with an adjudicator that, remember, they're not in front of you, they're virtual, okay? You have to walk them through with a well-organized tabbed binder, right? Or brief saying, Madam Adjudicator, at tab number 1, page 2 is a copy of the lease agreement. As you can see in this lease agreement, it says that if the tenant damages the property, they will be responsible for the repair. And we're talking about willful damage. We're not talking about wear and tear. You need to guide them. There are so many times when I'm watching a hearing and people are just all over the place. They don't know what they're doing. And it just shows me that they haven't taken the time to just sit and watch one, right? It's as simple as that. Tell them the story, right? Read it to them like a storybook that you would read a child. And I'm not saying they're a child. I'm just saying make it that simple, right? Come there. And if you want to take it further, you could look up case law. You don't have to if you're a self-rep. But if you have a representative, you better be sure that you ask them, are you going to bring up case law? Are you going to talk about other cases that are persuasive to my case? Ask them the question. And they may say, no, it's very clear in the act, right? The act tells you what you have to prove. People just don't read the act. So be prepared, be over prepared, tell the story, make sure you have all the evidence. And another thing, bring your witnesses. Talk to your witnesses before they come and say to them, look, I need you to be here. And if they are not going to be there, summons them to be there, because they could be the difference between you winning and losing.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you have to come prepared. You have to be over prepared. And practitioners, they practice. I don't know about others, but I actually sit and I run through these hearings with my team. We'll go through, we have meetings where we talk about the hearings and we run through them together. So then we can show up prepared. So make sure you know who you're, again, make sure it's a person that's been in the board before. And if they haven't been in the board, do they have somebody that can come with them and help them?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think the organization and the planning and the structure are extremely important when you're proving any business case, but especially so when you're in the law courts, because they're seeing thousands of people all day long and they don't want somebody going off on some big emotional tirade, but with no evidence. You know, you need the evidence. If there's some emotions attached to it, good, but they don't want the emotions without the evidence.
Absolutely. And another thing is watch the decision maker, right? The decision maker is recording the hearing, but they're also taking notes, right? So they often will refer to their notes. They have to make detailed notes that they then give off to another department that writes their decisions, and the decision comes back to them for their review, right? So you have to be very clear and not rush through this, right? This is not a race. It's a marathon. You have to go through it at a good pace where the adjudicator can stay with you, right?
Oh, okay.
So if they don't understand, you know, they might stop you and say, listen, can you hold on for a second? Or, hey, I have a question for clarification. Be ready to listen and answer the question, right? Don't talk over, like the people fight with these decision makers. It's not okay. And they mute them and they kick them out. So
yeah, they've got all the power. So
yeah,
you
absolutely.
want to keep them in your good books.
Absolutely.
Follow the
Absolutely.
rules, be polite, be respectful, be well prepared.
Another thing that I've been told is that the adjudicators don't have a lot of sympathy for landlords who have not bothered to learn the rules.
It really depends. I have to be careful answering this. I don't know about that. I think some of them are just really like you. Yeah, you should know better. But others are more willing to say, look, you're a self-represented, you know, let me point out the rule to you. Let me tell you what you have to prove to me. So it depends really who you get in their personality. They're all very different adjudicators. I will tell you, people say to me, oh, they're biased. They take the tenant, they're more for tenant than for that. Like, I don't think that that's true. I guess it's really based on your experience with the board and the adjudicators. I think that they're fair. They're very fair. It just depends how you show up in front of them and how you present your case to them. Makes a big difference.
Their job is to is to enforce the law. So that's what they do. It's not a matter of liking you or not liking you.
Yeah, their job is to protect tenancies too. And I know that sounds very biased itself, but if it's, look, there's landlords that take advantage of the legislation. Oh, I'm going to evict you because I'm moving in, and they never move in. Right? That's why the laws change. That's why there's a 1 month's compensation. That's why you have to live in the unit for 1 year, because landlords were taking advantage, right? Just as much as tenants do. I think it's very fair how they do it. I think it's, you can't blame it on one side, because on both sides you have negativity. So it really just depends. There are more tenants obviously than there are landlords. So it just seems that way. It seems terrible.
Yeah, it's funny. You go into some of these Facebook groups and the tenants are saying, "Oh, landlords are scammers and schemers, and they're always trying to rip us off." And then you hear the same thing from the landlords as well.
Absolutely.
There was a woman who was, I remember texting on one of the Facebook groups, and she said, all tenants are horrible. They get everything. Landlords get nothing. I've had 2 sets of tenants who trashed my property. And so I texted her back and I said, "I'm really sorry that that's happened to you. I'm just wondering what kind of a screening process you have in place."
Right. And also, how many times do you go to the unit? Have you been to the unit at all? Like I hear people that they're like, "Oh, I haven't been to the unit in 10 years. How do you know the condition of the unit? How do you know? Like, you're responsible if there's things that need to be repaired. If you don't show up for 10 years and something happens, it's on you as the landlord. So you can't complain. You need to have a process all the way through, no matter what. Right? People don't want to. I hate to say it.
I kind of agree with you on that one.
We call them check-ins.
Yeah.
Other than maintenance checks.
Or inspections, because those words
Inspection kind of makes people scared.
Yeah, check-in is good. Yeah. You're right. Inspection sounds harsh. Yeah, it's like
So tell the tenants before they sign the lease, when they're signing the lease. Okay, these are for our own properties because we have investment properties, and I always tell them that we're going to be doing maintenance inspection checks a couple times a year. I have to do it for my insurance, which I do. My property insurance requires me to have regular maintenance inspections. And then I have a whole maintenance checklist that I go through. So basically I'm checking for leaks, does the furnace work, but you're also checking to see how they're maintaining the property.
Absolutely.
And you're checking to see if there's any illegal activity. And of course they know this. So I always find people are on their best behavior when you come. They're showing up at the door, they've just showered, they blow dried their hair.
Yeah.
Smells like cleaner. I get kind of a kick out of that. But then at the end of the time there, they were having a good conversation. They're talking about their jobs, the neighbors, they want to let me know what's going on. If, an electrical outlet sparked, well, that's something I want to know. So they tell me stuff that I wouldn't get if they just thought to pick up the phone and call me. And there's things that I notice that I can fix to make things easier for them while they're living there, to make it a better property for them. So it's kind of a win-win on both sides. Plus you're building a relationship. They know that you're there to help them. The good ones do. Yes. And most of them are good. Most of mine have been.
Yeah.
And they're happy to see you the next time they see you. Sometimes we sweeten the deal. We bring in a gift card for Starbucks or
chocolates or something. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's amazing. No, I like that. Listening is very important because you never know what information you're going to get. I love that. That's great. It really, really.
Well, the sparking electrical one, that was kind of interesting because it was some young folks who had never rented before, and every time they'd throw the breaker, the spark would fly and then out of the kitchen counter plug, and then it would throw the breaker off again. They never bothered to call us, and this is really a serious safety thing. But we showed up there, and when we showed up there, that's when they asked us about it. So again, that's just because we're there doing the inspection or the check-in that they'd think to mention this kind of thing, whereas otherwise they'll let it slide. You don't know, that could turn into a fire, right?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But then we had a plumber come into our unit here. We have a tenant in our house, a legal suite, and there was a plumber checking something else, and he checked the faucets, and he said, "Oh, by the way, Nelda, did you know the faucet's kind of loose? You probably want to replace it. It's leaking behind the wall, or not behind the wall, but into the down underneath of the cabinet." Mm-hmm. And so I asked the tenant if I could go down and take a look at it, and he's like, "Sure." And I'm like, "This is kind of water damage. Like, it's been leaking for a long time." He goes, "Yeah, I kind of forget about it every time I do the dishes." Yeah. So, I mean, I caught it before it got moldy or anything else, and then the plumber came and changed the faucet. But a lot of times people don't think about stuff, or they don't know to tell you, or they're a lot of times afraid, depending on
Yeah.
what their experiences have been, that
Right.
if they do tell you something and you do go in to fix it, you're going to say, oh, you have to pay for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if it's set out by act in Alberta, but here it is the landlord's responsibility to know. The tenant doesn't have to tell you, you have to know. So, I mean, if the tenant would like to bring maintenance issues, yes, they should be telling you, but ultimately it's on us. It's our responsibility to do those inspections and to document what we see and to deal with it if it is a maintenance issue, not a cosmetic issue. I want to be very clear on this. I've had people say, oh, I just don't like the stove that I have. Can you please change it? And my answer has been, no, sorry, the stove is fine. There's nothing wrong. If you'd like, I can remove it and you can put your own, but I'm not going to buy you a new stove or paint my wall. No, it's cosmetic, right? If I have the time and I want to do it, no problem, I'll do it. But it is not required under the law for cosmetics to be kept up to the current style, right? I just want to be very clear because people think, oh, my paint. No, sorry, no, it is maintenance, safety standards and property standards, right? So you have to be very, very careful and understand.
Yeah,
that's what
and it's also get confused at times, wondering what they're responsible for and what the landlord is responsible for. And when I go over the lease, I'll frequently say to people, okay, let's say you look at the picture window and one day you notice that there's a crack through it and it's the building has settled and maybe you've got a stress fracture in the window. Okay, that is a maintenance issue. If it's a condo, they replace that because they're responsible for the exterior, the envelope of the building. If it's a house, I'm responsible for it. If you threw a plate through the window, you're responsible for it.
Exactly. Our legislation is very clear what the responsibilities are of the landlord, and it also has a section of responsibilities of the tenants. And I mean, for the tenants, there's 4 sections, and for the landlords, there's much more, right? Because it's their property.
Yeah.
But I like something you said, something that kind of just stood out to me: condominium corporations, and we get a lot of issues with those because what ends up happening with them is, who do you talk to? Can the tenant go to the condominium manager, or do they have to go to the landlord and the landlord goes to the condominium manager? Like, how does this relationship work? And I think the landlord needs to be clear how that relationship works, because there are tenants that I've seen where they've gone to building managers and they say, sorry, you're not the owner of the unit, we can't help you.
Yeah.
Right? Go to your landlord, which technically that is the correct way. The landlord needs to be involved. So I think it needs to be set out in the lease that, hey, if you have an issue with something with the condominium, come to me. When I'm talking about a common area, parking spaces, things that the condominium is responsible for, come to me and I will go to that. And it needs to be clear, because I've seen many arguments between condominium corporations and tenants.
Yes.
And it's just, it shouldn't happen.
Or even between condominium corporations, property management companies.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah,
because that's something we see too, because sometimes you get, not always, but a lot of times you get a property management company for the condo, and they think that it should be the landlord's responsibility. The landlord thinks it should be their responsibility. They have to take it to the condo board. It's not a priority on the condo board list, and so it gets bumped to whatever month, if it happens at all. And then the landlord's kind of holding the bag, wondering what happens here. You've got all these levels of bureaucracy. How come I can't get anything done? Well, you just answered your own question.
Right.
Lots of levels of bureaucracy.
Yeah, just in our situation here, I mean, ultimately it's the landlord. So anybody that works with the landlord or for the landlord is an extension of the landlord. But ultimately, landlord-tenant relationship is between the landlord and the tenant. So if the landlord has an issue with the property manager, or the tenant has an issue with the property manager, let's start with the tenant. The tenant, if they have an issue with the property manager, it is an extension of the landlord. That means it's the landlord who will be blamed. And the landlord must deal with that third party. If it's the landlord that has an issue with the property manager and doesn't know whose responsibility is what, that's a contractual issue, right? That's something separate. So you have to know who are the players and what are their responsibilities under your regional legislation. That's what you need to know. Right, so
we used to get flack from people who were property owners of condominiums, and Gil and I were the property managers, and or Gil was the property manager for the condo, And the condominium corporation required the owner to work with them about a specific area. And the owner said, no way, I hired a property manager. They should be able to deal with this. And they said, no, we can't. This has to be you. And that was sometimes very difficult for them to understand. But there again, it's their property.
Right, and they
Their
don't,
name's on the
they don't hold legal standing. That's the issue, right? So the landlord has to be in, yes, the landlord can hire third parties to do work for them, but they need to be aware. They can't just be hands off. They need to follow up with these individuals and understand, hey, you know, tenant is saying there's an issue. If they say, oh, it's your responsibility, no, like what is the property manager's responsibility? Understand those relationships by asking them. Like, just like you would interview a legal professional or any other professional, ask them, what will you be doing for us? If something goes wrong with the tenant, do you deal with that? Who do you go to? If you can't deal with it legally, do you have a legal person that would help? So you need to understand, answer, like what I would do is join some of these mastermind groups for landlords or investors and ask people, what questions would you ask third parties, and create a checklist for yourself. And then ask those questions, right? Keep it, again, it's business. You have to know how you're going to run your business. So set out your procedures now before you rent out your apartments or houses.
So is there such a thing as real estate being a totally passive investment?
Is it a passive investment?
Totally passive. I don't think it is.
No,
My opinion
I
is,
think it's
I
hands-on.
think,
I
I
think,
think
yeah.
you have to be involved to a certain extent because it's your investment.
Yeah, I mean, I know people that, look, we have a lot of international investors, right? They're not here. They have their realtor that does everything for them. Maybe that's okay in some situations, but I still see a lot of issues with that. The realtors get into a lot of trouble. They're acting outside of their scope of their practice. They have no legal standing. They get kicked out of the landlord and tenant board because they're not legal representatives. So no, I think the landlord has to have some degree. I don't think it has to be 50% even, but there has to be some checks and balances with third parties. Because you never know if somebody's like, look, we had a superintendent that went and pushed the tenant, and you know the landlord was responsible because they never dealt with the superintendent.
Oh, wow.
Right, so things can happen. If a third party acts out, you have to deal with it. You're stuck with it, right? So you need to you do need to be in the know, right? You do need to be in the know. So again, setting up those procedures. So yeah, there is some degree of hands-on for sure.
Yeah, for people, we used to say there were some people who were property investors who really did not have the stomach to be property investors because, like you said, you have to have some degree of involvement, and they didn't want any. They just wanted to throw money at something and walk away. And it, unless you're mega wealthy, I don't really think it works that way.
Yeah, exactly. And when they're taking their hands off, they're not hiring the right people, right? So again, like I talked about legal standing, there isn't anybody that can represent before the landlord and tenant board unless it's a lawyer, a paralegal, or somebody that's exempt under our act. And property managers, realtors, they're not exempt. So this is a big problem that we often run into, is that international investors or those that don't know the law will say, oh, my realtor will just handle everything. I know realtors put their hands on everything. I understand that. They're the go-to person, but they are not allowed to represent you legally here in Ontario. They're not allowed to. And if they're caught, your matter gets kicked and you just wasted time. So know who is allowed to go, and know that, just remember that anything that they do is your responsibility. I hate to keep, preaching that, but it's huge. Like, we have to be careful here because you can be sued.
Yep. It can be an expensive game.
Absolutely.
So, top tip.
I think this was your top tip.
Landlords needing to understand that renting is a business, which has
Yeah.
laws and responsibilities, documentation, utilizing the correct documentation, lease clauses, addendums, maintenance inspections is very important. So that's not actually a question.
So I'd like your thoughts on all of this, because you've been kind of talking about it all the way through. You've been saying, be responsible, learn the rules, even if you hand it off to somebody else, learn the rules, make sure that you're touching all the touch points that your tenants are going to be in contact with, so that you can see who's dealing with them and the property and, how the laws interact with that. So there is a certain amount of knowledge you have to have, but you are the paralegal, please take it from there.
You know what, I'm gonna add to this, because I don't know that I put that, I didn't give you that tip, but I will say this, or maybe I did.
I think I reworded it into top tip.
Yes,
You had
so
said
I
that was
don't see this in here, but I also do a lot of collections. I have a collection firm as well. It's separate from my business. And we actually collect on landlord and tenant board orders. So what I see a lot of is that the landlord did not collect enough information during screening to be able to enforce properly. So they end up with an order that they can't do anything with, or it will take a lot of time and money to try to find out what the assets are of that tenant. Like they have to do an asset search. So I always say to the landlord, make sure you get a lot of information about the tenants, right? Make sure that get driver's license, get license plate numbers, types of cars that will be parked in the driveway, information about employment, calling employment or employment letters, making sure that you look up, do a search on the employer, because some could be fake.
Yep.
Credit bureaus. When you get a credit bureau, you should actually ask in the lease for them to consent for you to pull the bureau, because you never know if someone's going to start to change their bureau. We've had that where they falsify information, they put it into into a photo. I can't even think. It's one of those photo programs where you can actually go change it. Photoshop.
Yeah.
Learning about whatever you can for these individuals, so that if something goes sideways, you have a way to, at least a couple ways to go after them more immediately than having to sit on the file for a while. I have files that from the beginning of my practice where the person had no job, had no form of income other than social assistance. And then all of a sudden later on in their life, they got employed. So we were able to collect. But sometimes it's a long process. Sometimes it's fast. So collect a lot of information about them. Social media searches are great. Google searches are great. Freedom of information, finding out if the individual has been evicted before, ordering those orders. Now on Canly, you can see that the individual's names are now released on the orders, not from past orders, but newer orders. So whatever you can do to cross your T's and dot your I's to learn about these individuals that will be residing in your residence, the better, just in case. So that's for collections later on. I'm just trying to think of another thing here. Paralegals. Okay, so I have here having a paralegal on retainer. So it's always a good idea if you have multiple properties, maybe not really one or two, I'd say 5+, to start to look for somebody that you're comfortable with before something goes wrong, right? So I have people that have come to me and say, Samantha, I just want to get to know you just in case. Like, I don't need you now, but just in case I have a question, can I call you? Absolutely. I'd rather you call me and ask me than make the mistake and call me and say, Samantha, I really screwed up. Now you have to fix a problem, right? So find a paralegal that you can either have on retainer, or if you don't have them on retainer, at least get to know a few that you can keep in your arsenal, right? Same with other professionals as well.
Yeah, you need a team when you're doing a real estate business. And a lawyer, paralegal, maintenance people. I've always had a team of people for my properties. I've got really trusted people, and they're worth their weight in platinum, honestly. You have somebody coming in there doing a good job who you like and you trust. Excellent. I have lawyers that I've been able to call and or email and say, here's an issue. Nothing has come up that's really serious yet, but this is where it could go. What do you advise? And you can go and refer to people. If it's something that's a little bit lower down the rung, not quite as serious, then there are landlord and tenant organizations I can refer to who are excellent, because they're like you. They've gone to court, they haven't gone to court, but they've got years of experience of clients who have gone to court, and they've heard all their stories, and they can say, well, this is usually how this rules. This is usually where the judges side. So you might want to look at this area. And that's worth its weight in platinum too, when you're trying to decide what decision you're going to make. Because Samantha had said this before, that you get a little nuanced difference and something that looks very black and white, and it changes everything.
Exactly.
Another point that I would make is that if I have an urgent matter that might potentially need legal, or there's going to be some legal implication involved, if I send a note to my tenant, they may not take it as seriously as if my lawyer sends a note to the tenant.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're so right. I get people that just call me they're like, oh, look, I can do the N4, the non-payment of rent for myself, but I'd rather you just send it with a cover letter. And I'm like, okay, not a problem. And people respond to that, right? I find that with my own, my family's tenants, our tenants, we get another legal representative to send a letter. I won't send it because they're like, oh, we know Samantha's a paralegal. So we just, seriously. Yeah, so we get somebody else, right? So it is very important that you have the proper individuals in your back pocket or in your arsenal. Very important. And then the other thing, very important information, like I mentioned before, is we have a standardized lease here in Ontario. That standardized lease allows you to have an addendum to it. Understand that you can and you should add your additional terms as long as they don't contract out of what the legislation says. So
Right.
the biggest thing is if you want to be able to have consent to pull their bureau. That is an important term. If you don't want them to smoke marijuana in your unit, tell them that. If they don't know what the rules are and they break a rule and all of a sudden now you're upset about it, well, why didn't you tell them in the lease? Right? I get people coming to me, oh, Samantha, they're fixing cars in the garage. Did you tell them they couldn't fix cars in the garage? Oh, they're operating a business. Are they operating a business or are they fixing cars in the garage? Those are two different things. So if you don't want them to fix their car in the garage, you need to say the garage is meant only as a parking spot or a storage spot, whatever it is you want, you need to lay it out at the very beginning. Like people can't guess. We can't read your mind. Lay it out. It's a business. Tell them what you don't want, right?
I actually really love that you said that because I read this book a while ago. I still keep it on my bookshelf. It's called Landlording on Autopilot by an American mega landlord, Mike Butler. And he talked about when he got his very first job, he was bagging groceries in a grocery store and he had 20 hours of training to learn how to bag groceries. And he said, if the grocery store gives you 20 hours of training to just bag groceries, why wouldn't you train your tenants to follow the rules that you've established or that are established already? Because he says the same thing too. If they don't do something that you wanted them to do and you didn't tell them, you can't blame them. If he considers them his tenants like his employees, and he says you have to train them into what you want.
Exactly.
You have to tell them, you must give them things in writing, remind them again, document everything. Everybody keeps a copy. And that way they know what you want and you know that they know.
Yeah, it's a relationship. And I use this with my clients and it's kind of funny. It's kind of not. It's almost like it's a marriage. It's a relationship. You're dating, right? That's kind of the way that I look at it. You set the expectations, right? You have to understand you might, and I hate to say stuck with this person because that's terrible. It's so negative, but you will have a long-term relationship with these tenants as long as you keep communication open, you set expectations, you follow what you've set out as well.
Yes.
And you work with the tenant, right? Oftentimes problems happen or issues happen because there's a simple disagreement. Maybe you've said something wrong or they've said something wrong and now you've misconstrued what's occurred, right? Oftentimes I could pick up the phone and talk to the tenant and come to a settlement, no problem, right? It's just, it becomes poisonous when the communication starts to go downhill. So start to look, if you notice there's an issue and something really amazing that I see my mother do, she has a conversation with the tenant. She says, look, we maybe had a disagreement. We misunderstood each other. Let's just kind of come back and let's fix this. Because ultimately she wants to keep these tenants for long term. And she does. She's had tenants for 20 plus years.
Oh, wow.
A lot of her properties. Yeah. And that's because she just communicates with them. And if there's a mistake that she makes, she admits to that mistake. Or if she misunderstands, she says, look, I think can you explain it to me? Why do you say that? So that I'm taking it the wrong way and I'm not sure why. So I love the way that she does it. And I think it's very important if people just communicated a little bit better, there would be a lot less hearings. But unfortunately, people fight and they try to take advantage of the system. And this is why our landlord tenant board here is so backed up. It's crazy.
Well, I think they are everywhere.
Yeah. The other thing I would say too is that you want to make sure, as far as disagreements or any other issues with the tenant, you don't want to be leaky. You don't want to be wishy-washy. You want to get on top of them as quickly as you can, because once you start establishing those patterns, then you've just told the tenant what you expect them how you've reduced your expectation, and that's going to turn into frustration eventually, and that's going to start fights. So a person has to be fairly quick to deal with any issues that happen, whether it's non-payment of rent or whatever other issues.
I'm always firm, and I've learned to be less heavy-handed. I think my nature, I mean, my Germanic nature is to be heavy-handed, but I've learned how to be a little bit more diplomatic over the years. For instance, if I don't get the rent by noon on the 1st, I'll just send a text out and say, just a friendly reminder, your rent was due at noon. Please send your rent, it's overdue. And then boom, usually people get right back to me because I have a really extensive, robust screening process, which by the way, you can get on my website, neldaschulte.com. It'll be up fairly shortly. And it's called Find the Best Tenants. And if you get good people, you can usually talk to them and they're willing to talk to you. And they appreciate being in a nice place and they appreciate that you're taking good care of it and you're taking good care of them. And you can usually work things out. If you get someone who flips on you, and there are those instances too. I mean, life's not perfect, let's face it. People go through divorces and their personality can change. They could lose their job. They might have an illness. Maybe something horrible has happened, a death of a child or something, and they totally turn into a different person. You can't possibly predict that. However, you can cover your bases as much as you can with the right documents, the right forms, and by keeping the communication open as much as you can. Like, I really love your mother's way of wording things.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
I used to, look, I'll be honest, I used to say to her, look, why are you being so, like, you're being too friendly with the tenant. Like, you're going overboard. And, you know, now that I sat back and I thought about, hey, you know, my mom has all these properties and she maybe in the last 10 years, she's probably had three issues. Like, that's pretty decent, you know, like if she was doing something wrong, she'd have issues with all of them. So
Yes.
she really, you know, I do like her approach, but I never really thought of it that way until I analyzed and I'm like, listen, it's simply a conversation. I do it for my clients all the time. So it's, you know, some of my clients are very stubborn. They say, look, I just want them out, or they're wrong and I'm right. Like, they just can't, their pride is taking over. Yeah. They can't see that going legal is not always the answer. We can mediate, we can negotiate. There are other solutions. So what she does is great. And, you know, I just want to go back for a second. There was something that you guys had said, don't decrease your expectations or lower your expectations. And I really like that. You can't give in to anything. You set those expectations, you must stick to them. You give a little, then unfortunately in any business, people take a lot. It's just how it is. So you can't say, okay, well, you know, oh, you can't pay by the 1st. Okay, I'll give you to the 15th. The next month they'll pay on the 30th.
Yeah.
You can't do it. You have to, there are landlords that I know call into the Landlord Self-Help Center, and Landlord Self-Help, they deal with low income landlords. Like, people don't realize there's such a thing. Okay. These are individuals that might have inherited a property, or this is their only income. You know, so it's a big problem if you give in to anything. So you don't have to be so tight knit that you know, you're going to evict at every turn, but you need to be firm on everything. You need to be firm and warn the person that, look, I don't want to do this, but I have to send you a notice, because if I don't, you're going to take advantage. And this is not how I run my business. Be very straightforward with them. And they'll either say, you know what, do what you're going to do, or look, you know, I'm sorry, I understand, like, I'm going to fix this, because they don't want you to go to the board. They'll get evicted. Yeah. Nobody wants to be evicted. And especially if it's inevitable, if they have no money and they don't pay their rent for months and months. So you really have to understand that there's a way to deal with this in a manner that does not have to go before any court or tribunal. People don't listen to that. Mediation is a new thing. I want everybody to understand. We are trained, lawyers have always been trained to advocate, to go to court and fight. And, you know, for years, through my training, I've always been taught to go to mediate. So it's interesting. I am a litigator, but I've always been taught by my mentor, Samantha, mediation is a great tool, because mediation allows us to figure out what are the actual issues here. Is it because you didn't pay your rent because there's a sick family member and the person didn't disclose it? Or are there other underlying issues that we need to know about? It's almost like counseling. I hate to say it, it's counseling, but you learn so much in those mediations or even the negotiations that opens up a whole set of factors that you may never have considered. So it's really good. Landlord tenant used to require, first they didn't require it, then they required it, now they don't require a case management hearing. So now it's optional again. But I would take the option to get in a room with the other side to hear what they have to say and learn from that information, because you never know what they're going to say in that room.
No, not really. You never really know what all people are going through. They don't always tell you. Well, case in point, I had a tenant who moved in, this was recently, this was a few months ago. It's a suited property, and some of the other tenants said, oh, by the way, there's someone else living on the property. And by the way, my utility bills were pretty high. I cover the utilities, include them in on the price. So I texted them once and said, has anyone else moved into the property? And they said no. And then I texted them again and said, the second time I just said, here it is in the lease. You're not allowed to move in another person without my knowledge or consent. Whoever's living there has to follow the application process, or I can evict them. So anyway, he calls me back. He's a shift worker, a very nice guy. Calls me back at 7 a.m. the next morning. He's already been at work for 3 hours. And he says, sorry, I said, well, just let me know what's going on with you. He said, my other roommate just showed up one day and he said, I just can't live with you anymore. I'm 36 years old. I need to be in my own place. I just feel like a loser living in a house with my roommate at this age. And he left. So he said, I didn't know what to do. I can't afford the rent by myself. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to look for another place. I got broadsided. So he said, I have this colleague at work. She agreed to move into the place with me. She's really good, blah, blah, blah. And so I said, well, give her my number. Let's connect and let's have her go through the application process. Because I said, I'd rather work with you. I'd rather keep everybody here and keep everybody happy. So we went through the process. She was really good. She was approved. And now she's listed as on an addendum as an other occupant. So it worked out. We're all in good terms. And that was a happy solution. But there again, it involves a little bit of talking. And I remember a lawyer telling me many years ago, when you're negotiating with somebody, you have to give something up. And I said, I don't want to give anything up. She said, Nelda, life doesn't work that way.
No.
You want them to meet you, you have to be willing to meet them. So each of you have to take a step forward to the middle. So I said, okay. So sometimes I have to give up my pride, because I think, what's the end result? What's the goal here? What do I really want?
Absolutely.
Do I want to have a big fight that lasts forever, or do I want them to pay on time and all of us to get along? Okay, I can swallow my pride this one time.
Yeah, it's a win-win situation. That's what I always look at. And it's hard to convince my clients. So I really try to lay that out for them. Like, let's write it out. I actually write it out in a chart and on a paper. And I say, look, let's talk about it. What's the worst case? What's the best case? Is BATNA and WATNA. I don't know if you've heard of that. Best case scenario, worst case scenario. And we go through it and we discuss it, but it is not easy when you have a person that's just like, you know what? I'm right, they're wrong. My pride. I don't care what you say. And it happens a lot. Like, I remember when the board was in person, we would have mediations that lasted 8 hours.
Oh boy.
We had some that could not settle and we ended up at hearing after that 8 hours. So it really, look, I say to people, the biggest thing is money. If you don't try to settle and give up something, then you're just going to lose more money. Not in all situations, but most of the time it's money. And people don't want to just throw money. They don't want to, right? So if they could find a way to keep more money in their pocket, you might have to give a little to get them out and then get a good tenant. And that sucks, but in the long run, it's better.
Yeah,
exactly.
Objective achieved. Yeah,
absolutely.
Aiming for an objective and a goal.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think that takes us to 8:06, which is still really good. And I would like to thank Samantha Glass from SFG Legal in Ontario, the chair of the Landlord Self-Help Center and the star of the television show Get Legal, who is an expert in landlord and tenant law because her family is an expert in property management and property investing. I'd like to thank Samantha very much for joining us tonight and shedding lots of insight on all
there was
these issues.
really good information.
Excellent information.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun. And honestly, I'd love to do it again, because you can never stop talking about this. Honestly,
Yeah, actually,
for another hour.
kind of a funny thing. The more I talk about this, the more I want to talk about it. You'd
Me
think
too.
I'd think of it after a while, but I never do. It's always interesting. All right. So if you like this session, those of you who are watching us, like us on Facebook. These videos are also on my YouTube channel, Nelda Schulte. So please like and subscribe. I'm also on Twitter at Nelda Helps Me. And if you'd like to have access to free landlording resources such as maintenance checklists and landlord forums and videos, you just have to click on the green membership button on my website, neldaschulte.com. Thank you all.
One quick question, Samantha, you've got some resources as well for Ontario?
Absolutely. So I mentioned the Landlord Self-Help Center. They're a great resource that definitely can help you out. They do landlord learning forums and other things. They provide documents, templates, and whatnot. Also, my website has a lot of information on there. So we often write articles. We often write articles related to most common landlord and tenant issues. So check them out. There's case law in them. You can use them as a secondary resource in court. And also look at your local landlord group. So other than the Landlord Self-Help Center that helps all of Ontario, they are a not-for-profit organization, a very small group. There's probably about less than 10 of them there. There are other organizations that are regional. There is the Kingston Landlords Association. I know that there is a few others out there that are amazing. What I would do is become involved with all of them because there's so much great information in all of them, and take the best out of each one and create yourself some sort of Google Drive or Dropbox where you put all the information in and get yourself some sort of procedures. Get it going. And if you ever have a question, you can reach out to me if you're in Ontario. Happy to even provide you resources as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. You've been an absolute wealth of information. Have a really good 1 hour of the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope you both have a wonderful night. And to all the viewers, thank you for watching.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
We already have had a wonderful night.
Me too.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.